Hello. So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I hope that there are some folks from Code 1 joining as they promised. We are going now to have a ball for my Jakarta EE all hands. So basically get some updates, get some questions answered by working group members and especially by Mike. And Mike will first start with a few slides with his community update, talk about that, answer a few questions, and then he has to run off, but everyone else still stay in the room. And when we start with the official questions, then we have 5 coupons for free ebook from Manning from my colleague Ken Finnegan about Java microservices. And if you pose a good question, you can win one of these books, except for Wayne. That's probably why he's running away. So, Mike, take it over.
All right, thank you, Heiko. So first of all, I apologize that I have to leave after 30 minutes. However, with Wayne and Tanya and Dimitri and everybody in the room, there's more than enough people here who are deeply involved to answer any questions that I'm not around for. So thank you for coming, and we think that there's a lot of really cool stuff going on. So next slide, please. So just start off with a quick introduction to the companies that are involved. And the strategic members on the left-hand side are the ones that are doing the heavy lifting here. So we have a group of companies and people that from those companies, and then also elected representatives that are very active in the steering committee, the spec committee, the marketing committee, and just generally doing an awful lot of work to get this off the ground. And so want to thank everybody, and many of you are in the room. Actually, put your hand up if you're on one of the committees involved in the working group. Right. So yeah. So you can see you have a really good cross section of people that are involved here, and so like I said, there's certainly going to be lots of people here who can answer questions. Next. So just a very quick high-level roadmap of what's going on. So we started this little adventure almost a year ago. Of course, there's a big difference. I mean, everybody in this room has been around the software industry for a long time, and you know there's a really big difference between what gets announced and then the actual reality. So the announcement, a year ago was we're moving Java EE to Eclipse. Fill in the blanks later, right? So, and we're going to talk a little bit about the scale of what that means, but but roughly what's going on at the moment is, and this is really happy to say, is we actually have a date for when we're going to ship the first release of the code that's being contributed into Eclipse Glassfish, so December 14th. Now, the good news is that's a fairly real date as these things go, because there's a plan and it's achievable, but it's a little bit on the aggressive side, right, Dimitri? It's not like it's a gimme, right? There's lots of stuff that has to get done. But we're very hopeful that before the end of the year, we are going to be shipping a Glassfish release from Eclipse, and that's going to be the culmination of I call it a metric shit ton of work. And then some point, the end goal here, of course, is to create not a Java EE 8 release. Actually, I should backtrack a little bit. So we're going to ship Eclipse Glassfish 5.1, and it's going to be certified as Java EE 8 compatible. But what this really is about is establishing Jakarta as its own spec process, and we still have some work to do on that, and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go through. So some recent accomplishments. So just to kind of give you a scale for what we're talking about here is, since basically January 1, which is when we really kind of got this thing going, at the Eclipse Foundation, we've onboarded 39 new projects. And there's been a few talks, I know, where they've talked about the scale of this, but between the TCKs and the Glassfish implementations and the jar files and everything, it's like roughly 10 million lines of code, right? And that's excluding comments, right? Like, 13.5 million lines. That's including comments, though. Yeah. So, but anyway, so can we all agree that's a lot of code? All right, let's move on. We've onboarded 160 new committers, and the IP team that sort of watches everything that's coming into Eclipse projects has already done more, 30% more work year to date than they did all of last year. And I want to, by the way, thank the Oracle team that we're working with, and I guess Dimitri, you're the only one here from the Oracle team today, but they've been great to work with. The steering committee is chaired by Will Lyons, and he's been absolutely amazing. It's been a very constructive and very congenial, collegial process all the way through. So I mean, there's been, and the thing about it is, from the Oracle side, I mean, they're taking all this code that works perfectly well right where it is, and we're dragging them through the Eclipse process, and it's an awful lot of work on their side. To basically get them back to where they were when they started. So it is an enormous amount of work. And then on our side, the pain that we have to bear is dealing with the Oracle lawyers. So negotiating the TCK agreement was an enormous amount of fun. And by fun, it's like kind of like catching leprosy, but and then we've have this approved plan, and we've keep going. And this is where we are now in terms of the onboarding. So basically, we've gotten pretty much every single one of these projects to the point where the next thing for them to do is to ship a release from Eclipse and exit incubation and actually become full-fledged projects at Eclipse. And trust me, that's like, it's an enormous amount of work to get us to this point. So some other things it's done, and I think this is one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this town hall, is we have this draft spec process that's open for community review. And I should have probably put a link in there somewhere, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop Wayne or I a line. But we want the community to give us feedback, because this new spec process is going to be absolutely critical to the future success of this entire initiative, because really what this is all about is increasing the pace of innovation in this area so that we can have more community-based specifications to evolve the Jakarta platform going forward. Then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to get done that's kind of process-oriented. And we're going to talk a little bit about the IP flows later. But this is an enormous amount of work on sort of our side as well, in terms of drafting new licenses, and making sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed in terms of the IP flows, so that when we create specifications at the Eclipse Foundation and the Jakarta Working Group, that they are IP clean, and the whole industry can base their products, but more importantly, their applications on top of this new platform, feeling very secure about that. So yeah, just flip through that. So in terms of the spec process, so when you're reading this document, a couple of things just to keep in. The screen just went blank up here. I didn't do anything, honest.
Mode folks still see us, as at least.
There we go.
Much better.
Everybody loves Max. So some of the guiding principles, code first. So this is one that's near and dear to my heart, and this is the idea that the best way to innovate is to try things out first, and in particular, try things out in open source. And then, so really what we want to do is get to a point where before you decide that you want to make a new spec, you have to hit two criteria. One is you have to demonstrate that you can actually build it, right? That you can build running code that does X, whatever that is. And the second, because we all seen specifications which were designed in a room that theoretically could be implemented, but why would you ever do it that way? You know, there's all kinds of examples from that right in Java EE. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is that somebody cares, right? We've also seen code and specs, for that matter, where people do things and nobody actually cares. So what we want to get to is the idea, we're doing this right now with the JNoSQL project, where they've got working code, they've demonstrated that people actually are willing to use it. Now it's time to actually start doing a spec. And I really think that those two criteria are important. You know, you can build it and that people care. No more spec lead. So the JCP process, for those that know it well, knows that the way that the process works is that each spec has a spec lead, which is a company, and 99 times out of 100, that company is Oracle. And all the contributions go to the spec lead, and then the spec lead licenses the spec out to the world. And so the way that this is going to work at Eclipse is contributions are licensed from the contributor to the consumers directly. And the Eclipse Foundation itself doesn't acquire any IP rights, and there's no special role for any particular company. So it's a much more vendor-neutral approach. We're going to run the specs as open source projects. So basically, if you read the spec process, what you'll see is that it's basically like a specialization of the Eclipse development process. So we've had this development process at Eclipse that's performed well as an open source community process for many, many years. Let's just basically add the little bit that we need to make it apply for specs. The JCP had this notion of reference implementations, which is a perfectly fine idea. And the reference implementations were normative. What that means is if the spec was ambiguous, if the TCK didn't test something, then the reference implementation told you how you were supposed to do something. And so instead of that approach, this process is going to have the notion of compatible implementations, and there must be at least one under an open source license before you can declare the spec final. But it's not that there's a special reference implementation that is normative. So that's actually quite different. The process of certification is going to be self-certification, but don't forget the TCKs are going to be open source, and all of your certification results are going to be published publicly. So it's going to be a very different certification process and TCK process than what we've had with Java EE in the past. And in particular, up until very recently, the TCKs were not only closed source, they were proprietary and highly confidential, right? If you wanted to get the Java EE TCK, a license to the Java EE TCKs, you had to sign a non-disclosure with Oracle just to get a copy of the contract, right? But I mean, that's how confidential this stuff was. And so we're going to go from one very extreme position to here it is. And I think there's going to be a very different dynamic now that the TCKs are open source, because if somebody thinks a test is bogus, you can have a conversation about that in a public forum, which is a very, very different dynamic than the way it's happened in the past. And then, if you're compatible, you can get the brand through a trademark license. And by the way, you will have to be a member of the Eclipse Foundation. There's no licensing fees, there's no royalties, but you do have to be a member. And so a little bit on the background on the IP flows is that we have to change. Well, I mentioned earlier that we have to change a whole bunch of documents or write a whole bunch of documents. So what are we changing and why are we changing them, and why is this important for people that are involved in Eclipse? So Eclipse has always had this symmetrical inbound outbound licensing model. That's the way we've always worked. And the default license is the EPL, which is actually a copyleft license. Next slide. So the problem statement is we want to have a spec process. We want to do code first. So we want to be able to allow people to build stuff in EPL license projects. It gets a little bit easier if it's Apache or BSD license, but we have to also support our own license. And some lawyers, I mean, I don't know how much time you've spent with lawyers, but basically the lawyers get paid a lot of money to think about everything that could possibly ever go wrong, right? That's what lawyers do. That's why there's so much fun at parties. So some lawyers had reservations about, hey, if we take code from an EPL license and it's copyleft, can we actually put that into a spec? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be updating the Eclipse contributor agreements, the committer agreements, our terms of use, to basically say, hey, if you contribute code to Eclipse and we decide to put that in a spec, you're okay with that. Now, we don't think this is controversial at all. If you're contributing code to an open community, the idea that somebody might want to, write a spec from that should not be, we don't think that should be a controversial statement. By that last bullet, I probably should have deleted for this point, but we also have to update these agreements anyways to get some GDPR related stuff in there because of privacy regulations. And so that's the update that I have, and I'm happy to throw it open to questions at this point.
So I have a microphone here for questions. There are also two folks at the moment remote that can also ask questions, but here goes the first one.
Thank you. I have a question about the TCK. I've read that the TCK in its current form is a kind of monolith, not split according to the different specifications.
Yep.
So is it still the case? Is there a plan to change that?
So is it still the case? Yes. The TCK was contributed by Oracle, and it is a monolith. Not only, it's even worse than that, actually, because not only is it a monolith, the testing harness that it runs in predates JUnit 1.0, right? So it's, not only is it a monolith, the framework, the testing framework itself is, really old, like almost as old as I am. Not quite, but so yes, that's the current state. Is there a plan to break it up? No. Is there a desire to break it up? Yes. And this is a perfect example of where the community can get involved, right? That's to be successful. We do believe that we need to have a TCK per project kind of map. And in my rich fantasy life, we actually use a modern test harness and move the test to something new. Both of those by themselves are enormous jobs. And we are going to need help from everybody to make that possible, right? Does that make, we definitely need help. But I don't think there's anybody that disagrees with those goals.
Yes, thank you.
More questions? And let me start one.
Okay.
Okay, yes. Ross?
So the old Java EE specification had some promise in it to be backward compatible all the time. We haven't talked anything about that, and I also find that there was good, but there was also bad things with that hindered innovation in the specification. So what's your thought about backwards compatibility when going forward with this?
So the first point is that's not my decision. I am not the boss of you. Or anybody else. So the role of the Eclipse Foundation, you have to remember, the Eclipse Foundation is not a vendor, right? Our job here is not to tell people what to do. So that's going to be a decision of the spec committee and the, however we decide to basically guide the architecture going forward. My personal opinion is that, being backwards compatible forever is not a great idea for any technology, and this technology is starting to approach 20 years of age. And so starting to actually, there is a deprecation process. There has been in the past. It just didn't get used a lot. And so I think that there's an opportunity to actually make use of the deprecation policies that were there. The culture at the Eclipse Foundation itself, if you look at the Eclipse IDE, right, we take, even though we didn't have a formal spec process at Eclipse, we take backwards compatibility very seriously, right? You can still run plugins on the Eclipse IDE that were written, quite a few years ago. So it's not, we don't want to sort of open the floodgates to, anybody can change anything and completely break backwards compatibility, but there has to be some kind of give and take. But actually, folks like Dimitri and Kevin probably have more to say about this than I do. Once you give,
yeah. So Dimitri, wait a second. I pass the microphone.
Here, that some time ago, PMC came out with technical vision for E4J project, And basically, the things you are mentioning are covered there. So we would like to embrace innovations, right, and keep backwards compatibility. But we also would like to remove some older stuff which is actually not needed, right? So don't worry about backwards compatibility. I think Java EE is all about backwards compatibility, and I hope that Jakarta EE is going to be the same. But we definitely want to do a little bit of cleanup, right, and remove some unnecessary parts. Unnecessary is the keyword here, right? So finish.
Yeah, and there's also I think there's another possibility too, which is around maybe creating not a huge number, but maybe a few more profiles that match modern application requirements a little bit better. I think there's sort of in the conversations that I've been in on the spec committee, there's definitely a lot. Nobody wants to have a whole bunch of them, but I mean, there could be one or two more that so that's another way to evolve it, right? Is you define some profiles that leave some baggage behind, and because they're new, they don't have the same list of backwards requirements as the full platform.
As you mentioned profiles, there is another Eclipse project called Microprofile. What's your take on that with respect to Jakarta and the future of Jakarta?
So are you asking my personal opinion, or
you can mark that as personal opinion, and afterwards the official.
The first thing to say is Eclipse Microprofile is a open source project at Eclipse that published some specifications, and that community and that project will make their own decisions, right? It's not there. My job is not to go and boss people around, right? So they're
yes.
That said, I think that Microprofile was originally created because the pace of innovation in Java EE wasn't keeping up. That was the original raison d'etre for Microprofile. We now have in a situation where it's been around for a year and a half and a little bit more. It's gotten quite successful. Project Helidon from Oracle is now using it, so it's not even the original founding members. It's got pretty demonstrably broad industry support. So I think over time, once the Jakarta EE spec process is up and running and has been demonstrated to work, that it would make a lot of sense for Microprofile to become part of it.
Okay, thank you.
But that needs to happen at a pace that feels right for all the parties involved.
Yeah. Another question on the guiding principles. You said no more spec lead. I know where it comes from with the IP flow, but you still probably want someone in a project that does the work, that calls for the meeting, that writes the meeting notes, that writes the document and these things.
Yep.
That still exists.
Well, you had me right up toward. I agreed with everything except the write the document. So the first thing. Okay. So yes, Eclipse projects have project leaders. So specification projects under Jakarta or at the Eclipse Foundation will have project leaders. But the position of an Eclipse project leader is a position of responsibility, not a position of authority. So a project leader at Eclipse is responsible for making sure that the project is operating properly and following the open source rules of engagement and so on. But they're not the boss. And in particular, one of the things that I hope is going to change is there are examples in the past at JCP specifications where there was a JSR that was there was an expert group that was there, and there would be remarkably little conversation for a long period of time, and then the spec lead would show up with a document and say, there's the spec, we're going to have the vote in 2 weeks. I'm maybe slightly exaggerating to make my point, but that's not what I would call an open and collaborative process. So in the Eclipse specification process, the expectation is that it's a group of people working together, and everyone is a committer. And if you have and the way it works at Eclipse is if you're collaborating on a document, every single committer on that project is going to have edit access to the document. Now, the interesting thing about that is, of course, if you think about it, what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is you're going to have more conflict. But the conflict is going to be open. It's going to be discussed. And ultimately, there's going to have to be perhaps some arbitration, but it's going to be a much more collaborative process than what we had at the JCP. And that's got some good things about it and perhaps some bad things about it, but that's definitely the way we want to go.
Yeah, my wording with writing was a bit bad, but rather like getting ahead, dragging the crowd along.
Sure.
And get the work done.
Pretty much everybody in this room has been a leader in some way in an open source project, and the metaphor about herding cats, right? We've all heard it, we've all lived it, right? That's I think the way it's going to be.
So, more questions?